ESID, our research centre, we've been doing quite a lot of work on inclusive institutions. And the whole debate around inclusive institutions is now right at the centre of debates around development theory and practice, both at a macro level, in terms of what explains how countries develop over the long term, and at a more micro level, in terms of local level interventions. And it's a very contested area around not just the evidence, but also different normative ideas around how people think the world should be, not just in terms of what it is. So on the one side, you've had lots of big books that you can see here on arguing the case for inclusive institutions being the key to development and how it unfolds. Whereas others have argued that it's not really part of the process of development, but rather an outcome. There's also a series of debates around whether or not we should be concerned about inclusion per se, in terms of the level of inclusive, how inclusive institutions are, but rather the type of inclusion, whether people are included on terms that are empowering or potentially disempowering. So there's those two sets of debates that run through all discussions around inclusive institutions. So looking at the first one, do inclusive institutions matter? Do they lead to more progressive forms of development? So two of the main authors on this, Acemoglu and Robinson, in their book, Why Nations Fail, have argued that what defines development over the long term, why some countries are rich, prosperous and democratic and others aren't, is essentially the move from extractive institutions towards inclusive institutions. And what they mean by that is that the political playing field becomes more level, that the access to opportunities and status that institutions generate isn't just captured by political elites at the national level, but becomes distributed more evenly throughout society. And so that shift away from, for example, only political cronies getting access to government contracts, those shifts towards who can stand for office, whether you have free or fair elections, rather than institutions which are more exclusive. So they've argued that case, and for them the only sensible policy move is to make institutions more inclusive. Now, that argument is countered by others who agree that institutions matter, and even more that the politics that shapes institutions matters, but disagree that inclusion is the key to shaping whether or not institutions have positive developmental outcomes. So other authors such as Francis Fukuyama and Mushtaq Khan have argued that what matters isn't the level of inclusion, but rather the capacity of institutions. So whether your political, bureaucratic and legal institutions have the capacity to maybe discipline capitalists, to regulate economic development in ways that are more in line with the national interest is what really counts. And what they argue is that actually inclusion can be damaging to development. That if you open up ruling elites to too much competition around who gets to control over institutions, then that can reduce the time frames which they use for governing. So they're unlikely to engage in building institutions that are developmental if they think they're going to lose power in the next election. Where international development tends to go wrong is that they presume that promoting openness is the answer to all institutional problems. And the different positions that people take on them is partly informed by their time frames. So Acemoglu and Robinson seem to be looking at an end point in history and saying this is where the West got to, that's therefore how other countries should try and develop. Whereas other thinkers are saying, well, that might be the end point, but what matters now in the earlier stages of development might be something else, maybe not inclusive institutions, but high capacity institutions. Okay, so in terms of how these debates play out, in terms of whether we should be pushing for more inclusion or actually think through things more in terms of capacity of institutions, a very clear demonstration of this is the shift that's occurred around the good governance agenda, which was promoted in relation to political conditionality throughout the 1990s and much of the 2000s as a means through which international development tried to re-engineer institutions in the global south, attempting to make sure that all legal, bureaucratic, political institutions were open, inclusive and accountable. And that's really given way over the last 10 years to a growing sense in which a good enough governance agenda is more realistic for such countries. The work of Mary Lee Grindle has been very influential here, that you're actually asking too much of developing countries to take on board all of these reforms in one go. And it might be better to have a more sequenced approach whereby you focus first on stability and the institutions required for that, then on building institutional capacity to actually deliver economic growth, social services, and so on. And only later do you actually get concerned very directly with institutions that are more inclusive and democratic. Now, this is highly contested. Some people think that the way in which the world works has to include a primary role for inclusion because it links into debates around democracy being part of development. It's an intrinsic good thing in itself. Whereas the skeptics tend to suggest that we need to know what works. First of all, let's find out which type of institutions actually deliver development in specific contexts, rather than presuming that inclusion is always the form that those institutions could take. So it's driven in part by the evidence, but you also get a sense that this is about the types of beliefs that people have and how they've shifted over time. So Francis Fukuyama used to argue in favour of liberal democracy as being the end of history, that we'd reached the high points of development. He now talks about the political decay that seems to have associated democratisation in the West, for example, the United States, and unfavourably contrast democratic states like India with authoritarian states like China in terms of how well they're doing in terms of achieving development. And so there's a sense in which there's a scepticism now in the West about what democracy can deliver, both in the global South and the global North, that informs these debates. So it's really not just about the evidence, but also about people's normative beliefs in relation to both sides of the world. The other side of the debate is whether or not it's the level of inclusion that matters, or whether it's the type of inclusion, and whether that type of inclusion is shaped by power relations. So coming back to the good governance agenda, there was lots of effort to promote inclusive institutions at the local level, decentralising responsibility and resources for governance and development to local communities, local governments. But what we found in that experiment that's been running for the last 20 years or so is that it can work if local governments have got high capacity with elites who are committed to development. But where that isn't the case, then too often those more inclusive institutions get captured by local elites and they don't benefit poor people. So in that circumstance, is the right thing to do to promote inclusion, or is it to try and challenge those power relations, which means that when new resources and authority comes down, they can't be so easily captured by the elite groups? And this comes through not just in political institutions, but also around economic inclusion. There's a presumption that, for example, gaining jobs as a form of economic inclusion is automatically better for poor people, whereas people like Stephanie Barrientos here at Manchester has shown that what matters more is the forms of pay and conditions that people experience when they do become integrated into global value chains as coffee producers, as workers in garment factories in Bangladesh, for example. That what matters is the terms of their inclusion as to whether or not it has developmental outcomes. So a lot of the debates around inclusive institutions are heavily polarised between those that believe that inclusion matters both as a means and an end in itself, and those that think we should only think about inclusion in terms of the type of inclusion, not just the level, that is, whether or not people are included in empowering or adverse terms. There is some evidence, though, that these things can come together, that promoting inclusion can actually challenge the power relations which lead to poverty and exclusion. For example, a colleague, Diana Mitlin, has done work with urban collectives in the South, in India, South Africa and elsewhere. Now, these are highly inclusive participatory institutions which seek to gain a voice for poor urban dwellers, slum dwellers, in processes of urban governance, shaping their right to live in the city and also the distribution of housing and water and sanitation services and goods. And what she's shown is that it's not just the effort to promote inclusion that matters, but doing it in a way that challenges power relations between, say, expert technocrats and local people who've got knowledge about how they think these goods and services should be delivered, and political relationships between people as clients or people as citizens, whereby they refuse to align themselves with political parties and don't allow themselves to be bought off by political patrons, but rather stay neutral from that and insist on being treated like citizens in the process. So where inclusion is promoted in a way that takes power relations seriously and challenges them, then we seem to see some headway, whereas the somewhat normative push for inclusion in any form has led to less promising outcomes than previously expected.